I was just able to sit down with Vandal Mann, and he is a retired squadron commander out at Luke Air Force Base, but he has endless war stories and he's been published several times. But ultimately, what I really love about his story is he's taken his military experience and a very humble upbringing, born in India, came across, put himself to the Air Force Academy, first applied for the Air Force Academy when he was in sixth grade. He was that excited. He has such a humble story, but ultimately the conversation was really more around how corporate America and the military can best work together. And some of the key takeaways I wrote down here were just phenomenal, where, military professionals can be seen as being pretty direct and pretty, use the word vulgar if you want. But what I love his challenge to that thought is our corporate America world has kind of become polite over results driven. And I think that there's a beautiful space in the middle for all of us. And I really hope that you take some time to listen to his thoughts. He has some really, really creative ideas around this, and I hope it will help you in your leadership roles.
I'm Stephanie, a mother, a pilot. I don't know. Am I trying to say the same thing or just talk? Welcome to the Wisdom and Wealth Podcast, where the stories you don't hear are the ones that matter most. I'm Stephanie, a mother, pilot, and commercial real estate professional with deep roots in Arizona. I was an entrepreneur at 24 and sold my first business at 27, and I've been navigating commercial real estate ever since. We are going to be sitting down with some of the biggest names in business around the Phoenix metropolitan area, as well as community leaders and nonprofit organizations that are continuing to improve our community. I'm very excited for the things that they chose to share when they thought nobody was listening. What I've learned in hearing their stories aren't just the struggles and how we overcome them, but really building a network around you of people that know you, trust you, want to help you, and you are trying to give just as much to them as they give to you every single day. And never connecting that relationship to a transaction. It's about the relationships, the connections, and understanding the true stories that shape success. And I hope you find inspiration in the conversations we have.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Good seeing
I
you.
love that we did this virtually so we can see all your photos.
Oh yeah. You gotta make it out to the house sometime, to the world famous High Key Saloon.
Oh my goodness. That is amazing.
Yeah, it's my little homage to 20 years in the military. So it's a cool spot.
I thoroughly, first of all, thank you so much for joining me today. This is really fun. This is a nice break from commercial real estate.
Yeah, there you go.
But I love it. So I would love it if you shared with me kind of, who does Vandal want to be known for today? Who is Vandal today?
Oh, who's Vandal today? Well, Vandal is a husband and a father.
Beautiful.
And that's kind of first and foremost. And that's, as you can imagine, that's kind of the driving force in life when you get to that level. I was born in India, and my dad was an engineer. And then he came to the U.S., oh gosh, when I was about 1 year old, and came to get his master's. And then kind of, as he's coming here to get his master's, he kind of looks around and realizes that, he doesn't really need his engineering master's, and he starts going down the entrepreneurial route. So anyway, that's a whole other story. But then my mom and I came over when I was about 8, and he had already been here. And then the parents got divorced, and you kind of read some of that in the history, and then grew up in Texas and had that, lifelong fascination with aircraft. And for whatever reason, I just always knew since my first conscious thought that for whatever reason, I wanted to be a fighter pilot. And so this is obviously pre-Top Gun and things like that. I have no idea where it came from, but it was. And so that was kind of the driving force in life, and I went off to the Air Force Academy, and, had a typical childhood in Texas, played football, Boy Scouts, student council, things like that. I was very fortunate and got into the academy, did that, had an amazing career, consider myself very fortunate. So I got to fly my dream airplane and flew F-16s for a couple of decades and peacetime combat, and then finished up as a squadron commander at Luke Air Force Base. And then, I really never had a plan. I mean, obviously I've got a lot of entrepreneurial folks in my family, and I always kind of knew there was something there, but after I retired, I became an airline pilot, and then it's just an easy transition. And there was always kind of, I almost say something was missing, and then just based on some timing and circumstances and things like that, I decided to start my own company. And that was about 5 years ago. And definitely the hardest thing I've ever done. I was a lot of time I joke with people that it was a lot easier being upside down over Baghdad at night getting shot at than being an entrepreneur. So it's certainly something that I learn something every day. But in terms of just the complexity of it, it's definitely the most difficult thing I've done, and that's where I am right now. So kind of, chapter one was youth, chapter two was my military career, kind of chapter three, which was a short chapter, is a commercial airline pilot, and then chapter three continued is this entrepreneurial journey that I'm on right now.
And can you share the nature of the business?
Yeah, so we're an aerospace defense services company primarily. So what we do right now, one of our focus areas is providing kind of high-end expertise to help the U.S. Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, U.S. Department of War, and allied nations in really high-end airborne tactical training, right? So we do that. Aviation support. We just recently had one of our guys in Ukraine helping with their F-16 program. And then I just got back from overseas last week where we were helping run an exercise. So aerospace defense services is how I would guess I would characterize it, but it's basically doing a lot of what I did in the military, but as manning and experience levels in the Air Force dictate, there's a requirement, there is a need to capture some of the expertise that maybe has left the Air Force. And that's what our company helps capture, is bring that back into kind of the ground level of tactical execution for Air Forces.
So I really am passionate about bridging the business community with Luke Air Force Base and all that happens right in our backyard, because I get to see it. I want everybody to see it. And one of the things, I was literally at a meeting last night with a bunch of high C-suites from our different hospital systems. And really what we're trying to do is create a program. And a lot of the medical professionals are former military. And we're really trying to continue to build that bridge. But it's fascinating to me how few business community leaders understand how to translate skill sets. And I know that we put a lot of emphasis on airmen to go, okay, your resume says this, but that doesn't mean anything to the outside world. We need to use different terminology, explain what that means. But I would call a challenge on both sides of the fence, that as civilians, we need to understand what skill sets we need to fulfill and look to these incredibly trained, incredibly professional, service-minded people and continue to build that bridge. Not everybody's doing what you're doing, is you're taking these skill sets and immediately applying them. But if you were to talk to somebody, what I want to know is, what made you do that? What made you say, no more commercial airline, I'm going to do this thing? Because what was your because?
So the because, and I'll protect the identities here, but my because ended up being, I ended up during COVID just having this opportunity to kind of dip my toes back into military aviation. And I did this and what I found was the company that I was working for, to put it bluntly, I felt like they were falling short of what they really should be providing the military. And the way I saw that manifest was, I felt like the young lieutenants and captains in the fighter squadrons that we were supporting were losing out. And so I found it to be very, very frustrating. And almost frustrating in the sense that there's so much progress to be had, and I felt like I was being held back by the structure. And probably, one of my greatest superpowers that led to this decision was ignorance, right? And when I mean by ignorance is I did not know what I was getting into, right? So that frustration translated into me waking up one day and just being like, you know what? forget it. I'm going to start my own company and I'm going to do it better. And where the ignorance comes into is, I don't have a business background. My degree from the Air Force, more on the technical side. The core curriculum at the Air Force Academy, very engineering heavy, right? Had some management classes. So I did not really understand the first thing about starting a company, which, it's beyond just starting an LLC.
Mhm.
When you start getting into the federal defense space, just the requirements and the complexity of it, just admin wise, is overwhelming. And had I known that, I think I'm about 99% sure that I would just been like, you know what? I've got a great life. Why would I want to deal with this? So this is where the ignorance comes in and a little bit of naivety. So it's like almost like the allegory of the cave, but my own version of it is I stepped into the cave, not really knowing how deep the cave was. And then you kind of take two steps. And a lot of what I learned was just by making mistakes, right? Of where I started my LLC and what my vision was and things like that. And then when I got into the defense space, into the federal space, I'm like, ooh, that structure does not work, right? So lots of mistakes. And then, you take two steps in and then you see what's two steps beyond. And you're like, okay, well, it's just two steps. And you take those two steps and you see the next thing. And so I never had a full view of how deep the cave was because I probably wouldn't have entered. But then in increments of a couple of steps here, a couple of steps there, next thing you realize you're pretty deep into this thing
Mhm.
and going backwards is no longer an option. So
Yeah.
that's why, I kind of joke that ignorance was my greatest gift. And I just didn't know the magnitude of what I was undertaking. And then once you're in it, you're like, okay, forward's the only way to go. And then to your point about the military skill sets, 100% right, right? So, in the civilian community, if you've got no connection to the military, especially, you look at the military as this just homogenous, amorphous kind of blob of individuals. And it's really not because there's so many specialties in there. Were you in the combat arms section? Were you in the admin support section? Things like that. So those are for specific skill sets, right? And so, while there is a lot of commonality with your brothers and sisters in arms, you can take two people that do two different things in the military and they have a completely different life experience, right? And some things like when you talk about personnel, finance, contracting, things like that, they have direct translation into the corporate world, right? Whether it be HR, finance, personnel, whatever it is. The more difficult thing is people that do something very specialized that's related to combat arms, right? Whether that be a tank driver or a fighter pilot or, a submarine crew member, things like that.
Mhm.
Those are tougher to find parallels in the civilian sector. However, the part that those folks have a tough time, and like you said, it's a two-way problem, right? The part that those folks have a tough time translating into civilianese, if you will, is the commonality of the leadership and the responsibility that a lot of these folks get at a very, very young age, right?
Mhm. Yep.
So those common things. So at a baseline, right? If you're a commercial company and you're hiring out of the military, well, you have a couple things that you can take for granted. There's somebody that knows how to wake up, show up to work on time, and do the work, right? So they've got some demonstrated work ethic that there's less ambiguity, and so you're getting somewhat of a known quantity of just the
Mhm.
basics. This is
Yep.
an individual that knows how to show up on time to a place and take on a task, right? Then beyond that, leadership and responsibility is probably the thing that is the most valuable from military. You look at CEOs of Chrysler or major companies or United Airlines at this point, right? That are the United Airlines CEO was an Academy grad, Air Force
Mm.
Academy, several years before me. Bob Lutz, who used to be a chairman of Chrysler, was a former Marine fighter pilot, right? So those things are very valuable. And then the other thing I realized when I got into the corporate world, I worked for the union president at my airline for some time, is what I realized was leadership, right? The L word. is something that I won't say it's lacking, but it is a thing that I just feel like the world is starved for leadership. And I break apart, leadership is not management, right?
Right.
And even in the military, we sometimes conflate the two. And what we are really talking about is management. We start calling that leadership. I have a personal view of that where I really disagree with that. I believe that management is a subset of leadership and not the other way around. So management is the tools, a tool set that is subservient to leadership, right? It can't replace leadership. So that leadership thing is an intangible that, especially in the combat arms part of the military, that is difficult to quantify, but it is the intangible that is there because your entire military career is based on first learning how to be a good follower. And then as you get more responsibility, learning how to be a leader, right? So I was a 21, 22-year-old new graduate of the Air Force Academy. And one of my first jobs in the military was being a flight commander for a shop that had 260 people, right?
Oh, wow.
And so that's as a, where in the corporate world are you right out of college as a 22-year-old going to be responsible for running an organization with 260 people, right? Now,
No
I
doubt.
had amazing senior NCOs that yes, they're your followers, but they're also mentors, right? That these are folks that have been in the military for 20, 30 years,
Mhm.
and their number one job is to how to keep the lieutenant from hurting himself, right? So so there's that mentorship and that leadership, that accepting responsibility. That is a tough thing for military folks to quantify and put that on paper to in a way that is appealing
Mhm.
to corporate America. Because how do you translate? I drove a tank for 20 years.
Right.
It's like what is the skill set you're looking for? It's the intangibles that need to get quantified.
This episode of Wisdom and Wealth is brought to you by Landmark Title, the experts in title and escrow services. Landmark Title brings decades of experience and a commitment to excellence to every transaction. Learn more about how their team can help protect your investments at ltaag.com. Landmark Title, building relationships built on trust.
One of the things that came up last night in our conversation was, and it never dawned on me until this moment, that in the military, you don't have the ability to fire somebody. So you don't like them, it's not working, get out. It's like you have to, at some level, make things work with the people that you have. And the people are the hardest part of any business.
Well, I would say yes and no, right? So I would certainly, I'll take a little bit of exception of the inability to fire people. You absolutely do, right? So that was kind of one of my early trials by fire, right? Of having to get rid of folks from the Air Force, right?
Okay.
So I'll give you two examples. One is as a brand new second lieutenant. After my first job, which was as a flight commander, I was the assistant flight commander, so the number two of an aircraft maintenance organization, which had the same about 200 folks in it, right? And we're responsible for maintaining all these F-16s at a base in Nevada. And so there's two things. There's skill problems and there's character problems, right? So for skill problems, the onus is on you as a leader and a manager to mentor and fix the skill problems, right? That's an easy challenge. The character problems, and that's one of the things I think the military tends to be very good about, is you get a chance to fix it. But a lot of times, a character is a compilation of how you were raised, your background, your values, things like that. And so we had a young troop that, just tended to get in fights. And these aren't innocent kind of scuffles. These are, there were some serious character issues where he was a disruptive force in the organization, right? And in being that way, he was bringing some of our exceptional performers down to his level versus the other way around.
Yuck.
And so we actually ended up getting him out of the Air Force, right? And that's,
Really?
yeah. And so you had to document the failures and things like that, and the attempts to rectify the problem. But in the end, it was one of those things where it's a tough call, right? It's a very tough call. But we'd been on a couple of temporary duty assignments where he had gotten arrested and things like that. So, the paper trail was getting built, but eventually we had to realize that, this is not something that we can rehabilitate. This is a
Yeah.
core character flaw, and we need to get this out of the organization because, there's two ways in an organization that you can run off your superior performers, right? One is abuse them and a lack of recognition and a lack of ownership, buy-in from them. And the other one is allowing, for lack of a better word, toxic people to continue on in your organization, right? So people need to see that, one, you have their back, and two is you have their back and you have standards and you are willing to make the tough calls, that somebody that is disruptive to the organization is you're willing to make the tough call and get them out of the organization. Because it's very demoralizing to see somebody that, from a high level, from the leadership perspective, they put on a certain act for the leadership, but among their peers and subordinates, they're not respected, right? And so that is an important thing to do. And the other example is, when I was a squadron commander at Luke, it doesn't happen often, but there are sometimes you end up with individuals that just don't hack it, right? They're great individuals. They're super intelligent, super motivated, but they just don't have the thing. Your brain has to work a certain way to be a fighter pilot, right?
Yeah.
They just don't have that thing. And so you convene what's called a flying evaluation board, and which then you start the process to get them out of the F-16, in my case, F-16 training, right? Your brain has to work a certain way in aviation, but then take that to an extreme. Single seat, high performance aircraft, combat aircraft is the next level. And so
stay there for a second. What is that? Explain that to somebody that's never been within 50 feet of an F-16. Like, what is that thing? What is that? If you could describe it.
I would say it is a way that your brain rapidly takes a stimulus, processes it, and makes a decision, right? So it's, when you're flying around at nearly the speed of sound, and milliseconds matter in decisions you make, whether it's defending yourself against a threat or attacking something, things like that in hostile environment. It's almost an athletic endeavor, right? So, I played football in high school, and you see some of the same traits, right? Of, let's say, a quarterback or a running back, like instantly being able to identify an open receiver or a gap to run through and things like that, and make those decisions on the fly under a lot of pressure, right?
And execute.
Because and execute, right? And so there's a level of composure, there's a level of calmness, there's a level of calculation. There's your brain, there are things that have to happen subconsciously so that cognitively your focus is on executing the mission. So if you don't have that cognitive processing power and again, it's not an intelligence thing. I know some incredibly bright folks, MIT type folks, that rapid processing, perceiving a stimulus, coming up with a response on the fly, almost subconsciously, that's a thing that is just essential for fighter aviation, right?
In your opinion, is that saying more nature or more nurture?
I think, again, this is just my opinion. It's like Tom Wolfe and The Right Stuff. Like, you either have it or you don't, right? If you don't have it at all the training in the world won't get you it. But if you have it, within the habit category, there's spectrums of habit, and training can help augment that and make that better and reinforce it. But there are just some great human beings that just don't have it. And it's not a hit on them, right? It's just like, not everybody can play in the NBA. Not everybody can be a chess grandmaster, right? So not conflating the thing, but there is a unique thing to be a successful, high performance fighter aviator that you just have to have. And, I read a book once about, the thing that, is very unique to fighter aviation. It's not unique to fighter aviation. I think you find it in a lot of the combat arms, is in a pressure crisis type situation, being able to cut through that and identifying the problem and coming up with a solution on the fly, right?
Yeah.
And some creativity, some three-dimensional spatial awareness, all those things are contributory. But what I think makes great fighter pilots is not the hands. It's not like, man, they can fly an air show or they're really precise with that. It's really how fast their brain works. And so I've known guys that are, maybe somewhat ham-fisted, but their brain, it's like they just understand the three-dimensional space and they know about this thing that's 60 miles away and this other thing that's 10 mile away and this other threat that's coming at them from this direction. And they're just able to process it and synthesize it in their brain. It's almost magical, right? And those are the folks that you find are the best fighter pilots in the squadron, is that ability.
And so I'm glad we accidentally kind of got here because it's one of the questions I really, really wanted to ask you. Outside of being a commercial pilot coming out of the military, what else are the pilots good at? What else could they really translate their skill set as far as you see?
Yeah, this is something I also discovered kind of as I made my rounds post Air Force, is one of the things that I found very prevalent in the commercial space is this tendency to want to love to have meetings to admire the problem. And,
I'm writing that down.
right. And so you go from meeting to meeting to meeting, but there's almost this hesitance. And some of it, you kind of see it magnified and amplified with the different cohorts in terms of generations and things like that. Gen X, Gen Z, millennials, all that stuff. Each generation is a product of the society that they grew up in, right? And so I'm Gen X. And I would say, we had a very blunt growing up. And so maybe that's contributory, but especially in the fighter business, one of the things I really liked about the fighter business is just absolute raw honesty, right? And sometimes that honesty was not polite, right? So the reason you have to be so raw and honest is because you're dealing with life and death type stuff daily, right? Even if you're not getting shot at, there's a saying that aviation is inherently safe endeavor. It's just incredibly unforgiving of mistakes, right?
Mhm.
So, and you magnified that a million times when you get into fighter aviation, right? You might be doing 600 miles an hour, 500 feet off the ground, where 2 seconds of inattention is what's going to result in you becoming a smoking hole in the ground. Then this is just peacetime training, right? So that raw and honest feedback is essential, right? And I call it, the fighter pilot debrief, where there's no rank in the debrief, and
Ooh, I like that.
you basically walk in and you strip down. Thick skin is required, and you identify the problems, you identify your own mistakes, you identify other people's mistakes. You just can't sugarcoat it, right? Because you're talking about life and death. And so, but then when the debrief, like I remember as a young fighter pilot, just absolutely getting skinned alive in a debrief, right? But once the debrief door is open, that person that just skinned me alive, we would go have a beer. And so there's no taking things personally. So that is a difficult thing to translate. A lot of fighter pilots or special operators or combat arms folks, that's one of the challenges, is you have to sort of debluntify your communication style to make it appropriate for a corporate setting. But, to your question of what is it that fighter pilots, and I don't think it's unique to fighter pilots. I think it's maybe more unique to just any combat arms in particular, is the ability to walk into a room, into one of those meetings, identify a problem, and rapidly kind of come up with solutions, right? And the problem with that is, in the corporate world, especially these days, where politeness is almost valued more than results, somebody right out of the military can be viewed as overbearing or too blunt and things like that. So that is something for the individual. They have to, you have to have, in addition to IQ, you have to have EQ, right? Which is, how are you being perceived? And you almost have to have two things. On one hand, you're transmitting, but you have to look around and look at your audience and be like, okay, this is what I'm transmitting, but I also have to perceive how am I being perceived? How is what I'm saying being perceived by the audience? And that's a challenge. But that is, I think, a unique thing that you get out of the military. Again, I'll say, in particularly in the combat arms side of the military, is the ability to be a decisive problem solver. But the challenge is how not to come across as overbearing. And then sometimes it just is. I mean, you know, I there was somebody when I was working at the union that she was ex-military herself. And after a couple of months, we were just chatting, and she said, I kind of just, I figured out who you are. And she's like, you're a disruptor. And I happened to be the one guy that in that crowd that had a fighter background. She's like, you're a bit of a disruptor, but in a good way. And because I kind of walked in and said, well, here's the problem. This is what we need to do. And it was my communication style is direct, but it ruffled a lot of feathers, right? It ruffled a lot of feathers because it was the thing I hate. My least favorite words in the English language is like, this is how we've always done it. And so for an outsider to come in and I had the freedom of, it was not a job I asked for. I got recruited and I kind of said, no. And after a matter of months, I finally gave in. I said, I'll do it. So I didn't care if I didn't have the job. So I was able to be very, very honest. And that resulted in me doing it for 5 years. And it worked out, but there were certainly ruffled feathers early on. And that was something I learned that, I can't be like I was in a fighter squadron. It's like, here's the problem. Let's do it. Move out. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to get people on your side and get them to share your vision.
Get them on the bus before you start driving the bus. Yeah, it's hard. Right. It's hard. I was raised by a undercover narcotics detective. We were raised in a no bullshit house. Mm-hmm. And I was an entrepreneur early in my career. And then I took my first corporate America job. And I've tried corporate America twice. It's not for me. I've learned this finally. Right. But it's just so interesting. And somebody said that to me. I'm like, this is how we're going to get it done. Let's just go get it done. And how slow progress can be because you have to first have 100 meetings to convince everybody of this idea that everybody probably knows is right, but they're just not ready for it to be right. I'm just like, this is soul crushing.
Right. Yeah. And the decisiveness is definitely a thing that I think is a trait, a decisive decision-making, owning the problem, finding a solution, coming up with a plan to solve the problem, and then getting people to move out. That is definitely a skill set. The challenge is how to convey that and get people to share your vision and inspire them versus the heavy-handed kind of like, in the military, one of the benefits we have is there's a rank structure. So when the commander says, this is what we're going to do, okay, took everybody's inputs, got everybody's inputs, synthesized them, here's how we're going to march forward, right? That's very easy to do in the military because of the rank structure and the command structure. More difficult to do in a collaborative work environment where everybody has to say their piece. And how do you tell somebody that you're not going to go with their plan without the hurt feelings brigade kind of being activated?
So we're kind of up on time here, and I've learned at the 30-minute mark, people love podcasts. But the one thing is, if our audience is predominantly kind of business leadership in and around the Phoenix area, as now that you've lived and functioned effectively on both sides of this conversation, what would you want that audience to know as far as it relates to anything that you've seen, you wish they knew, wish they did, wish they understood? What would you like to share?
I think if I was to kind of drive into one theme, it is kind of getting back to what I talked about before, is people are hungry for leadership, right? Mm. People are hungry for leadership, not in a under the thumb kind of, there's toxic leadership as well, right? So people are hungry for leadership, and the trap you can fall into is conflating management with leadership, right? Mm-hmm. Management is tools. It's how you run the company, the business, whatever, the back end of it. Leadership is what will make a difference, right? There's tons of examples in the corporate world, right? Whether it's a Herb Kelleher at Southwest Airlines, or Fred Smith at FedEx, or, Steve Jobs, or, there's in what set those folks apart was leadership, right? And so over the decades, what you've seen in corporate America, call it the HRization of corporate America, right? So again, with all due respect to all the great HR professionals out there, but HR, and I absolutely despise that term, and then, some companies started doing, instead of HR departments, people departments. And I've started disliking that term as well, because it's too kitschy. It's like, oh, people, right? And it's like you're doing the same thing. You're just calling it, you're packaging it differently. So I don't know, personnel, whatever the thing is, these are people, right? And you manage resources and you lead people, right? And so I don't like the human resources thing, because then people, the mindset kind of becomes people are just widgets to be managed, right? And that's not, like, especially for smaller and mid-sized company, I think leadership is much easier to execute than it is for a huge multinational corporation, right? It's just so big. But within even those large corporations, you have managers and different positions within where you are actually interacting every day with your people, right? And so in the current environment where everything is very legalistic and everybody approaches HR with a how do I not get sued mentality versus what is best for the people, right? What is best for the organization. And so that conflation of management and leadership, I think, is something that, and maybe we're kind of turning the corner a little bit societally, where I feel like HR, instead of being a supporting effort, has kind of become almost a main course, right? All decisions are made through HR. And when I say you're seeing a turnaround, there's companies like Boom Supersonic and other companies that have pretty much don't have HR professionals. They have their core skill set people, whether it's engineers and things like that are actually running the hiring and the recruitment process, right? And Boom Supersonic is one that stands out in my mind right now, just because I heard their CEO on a podcast recently, and I was just like, oh my God, like everything he was saying, I was like, that is right in line with my philosophy. Like, I got to reach out to this guy and see if he wants to work with us somehow. But it is, and HR has become a substitute for leadership, right? So a human resource unit, rather than getting to know the person and understanding them and their motivations, you just like outsource that to HR. These folks that maybe don't understand the thing that you actually do, their expertise is not in engineering or whatever your company's forte may be. Their expertise is just managing human resources. So you need that, but you need that in a supporting role, not in HR becomes the primary driver of your company, right? And so in the airline business, there's a constant tension where HR departments want to hire pilots, and pilots are like, no, we want to be involved in the pilot hiring because we understand what it takes to want to sit next to somebody for 3 days at a time.
No doubt.
They need, versus HR has their kind of formulaic criteria for bringing on an employee, or an engineering company that understands this is the kind of engineer I need. These are the personality traits I want them to have, that HR might be kind of divorced from because they do HR. So I think that leadership versus management thing is very important.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for helping me by coming on here to bridge this gap. I was able to have Chief Christensen on the other day too. So it's like, it's really fun to use different creative ways to keep these doors wide open so we're all talking to each other. So thank you so much for making yourself available to do that.
Absolutely. Really enjoyed it, Stephanie. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for tuning in today. I hope the conversation was inspiring for you. I hope you got a few laughs out of it and learned a thing or two. Please like, subscribe, and love you. See you next time. Now we're in the streets, y'all. I'm a mom.